what Graeme and I are going to talk to you about today is our data journey and a little bit about the history and actually what we're doing in the future. Next slide, please. So to introduce ourselves, I'll start first and then I'll hand over to Graeme. So I'm Karen Alford. I work in the Asset Management Directorate of the Environment Agency, and I look after the asset data and information. And this role has it's increased over time, and actually what we're really seeing now is the opportunities data is really bringing to our organisation and how we can make best use of technology, which we will explain in a little bit more detail during the session. Graeme, shall I hand over to you?
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, Graeme Tappenden. Would have to ring exactly as I go on the presenter mode. Graeme Tappenden, yes, I've been working with CAN for the last 6 years supporting the Environment Agency data journey, but I've also been working with other government departments. I specialise in information management, and it wasn't heavily involved with BIM, but that's become more information management as time has gone on.
Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to say a few things about the Environment Agency. I'm sure that everyone will know that the Environment Agency primarily undertakes 2 tasks, one around environmental protection and the other around flood and coastal risk management. So as an organisation, we operate and manage a number of assets. We also support and operate some assets that we don't own ourselves, which is an interesting dynamic, but those assets actually contribute to the main river flooding across England. We don't cover anywhere other than England. I think what is interesting about our assets is that we have symbolic major assets such as the Thames Barrier, which most people will be aware of, but we also have thousands of smaller culverts and footbridges and lots of assets that you could possibly say actually sort of merge into the environment. So things like embankments that you will experience and floodwalls as you're walking along the riverbanks or other areas, and sometimes actually they are so well disguised they might be built into the environment that you may not even realise that they operate, they have that level of functionality. So as an organisation, unlike perhaps some other government organisations, we deliver a large number of projects because although we do have some major projects, we also have a significant number of smaller projects which deliver improvements, either sort of building or refurbishing those. We have an current annual programme of 300 million annually, and as part of that we have to provide improved protection to 300,000 houses. So we are supported by our framework suppliers that have changed over time since we've been really focusing on our data, and we have a good relationship with those, and we work in conjunction with those to help us deliver. Next slide, please. So I just want to sort of cover off, why is it that we need an approach to the way that we manage our data and information. I think I'm not going to obviously go through this slide, but I think as a business, we recognise that the IT that we have supporting our business, it probably we won't be using the same IT in 10 years' time, but the data that we have about our assets, and some of our assets can date back to Roman times, the 18th century, 19th century. That information will continue to be with us for the foreseeable. We build assets with a life of 100 years plus, so we need to preserve that information as best we can. And we have struggled with IT, particularly data storage, as data has, the data that's created has become significant, as our internal IT infrastructure hasn't necessarily grown to accommodate those. So we've ended up having to adopt as local storage areas to facilitate our ability to work. And we worked with Building Smart, I think it's back in 2014, 2015, and they had a look at what we would deem to be a small project. And that small project had 200 gigabytes of data. And we determined that only 20% of that information was digitally accessible. So that was, it had a file name that you could recognize and a machine could read, or it was locked in, or it was lost because it was locked in proprietary software. And I think as a construction industry, that is a real problem, because as we, there's a whole wealth of technology that we can use, but if that information, that data is locked into software that we can't get out, then that value is lost. And we exchange at the moment about 10,000 files a month. So if you think about 200 gigabytes, 20% on a small project, times that by 700 projects, plus more for the bigger projects, it's a big problem. So we really had to get a handle on how we manage our data and information alongside our IT infrastructure. Next slide. So as part of this is what we have a program called the Creating Asset Management Capability, so a capacity, and it's been running since about 2012, and it has predominantly sort of focused on the IT infrastructure and delivering improvements. We're actually going through the second phase and second iteration of some of those, actually. So things are transforming and improving. But what we have recognised is that we have silos, we have systems that sit in silos, and to be able to move information around and deliver benefits, we need to have consistent approaches to the way that we manage and structure our data, and we also have to look at ways that we can bring that information together. DADI, the Digital Asset Data and Information project, is all about creating what I sometimes refer to as the glue that's about bringing it all together, so that when we want to respond to the challenging questions, we want to move data and information around, actually we're doing it around solid, agreed standards and data structures that facilitate the sort of digital delivery. We are an ISO 55000 accredited organisation. So as part of that, information management is very key to the capabilities. So we're operating within that framework, and we see some of the work that we're going to describe a little bit later as being key to enabling the whole modernisation programme for our asset management capability. Next slide, please. So we've got our vision. And our vision is very much around producing provenance from our data, getting the data right at source, enabling people to be productive, whether they sit inside our organisation or outside of our organisation, and that actually we can use technology, whatever that might be, because we recognise this this market is changing significantly all of the time, but we want to be prepared to adopt new technologies as they come about, and we need a coherent way of doing that. Next slide, please. So it all really started out back in 2011. The government issued, as part of their government construction strategy, they mandated central government departments that procured construction projects to deliver what's called a BIM mandate, Building Information Management mandate. And the Environment Agency was one of those departments. And to support the development, though there were some standards that had been published at the time of the mandate, to begin with, we didn't actually have the standards to support the journey. And as a sort of one of the central departments, we did actually sort of contribute to some of those developments, which are now actually transforming into the ISO 19650. I mentioned about the asset management strategy, and we immediately saw the alignment of the PAS 1192 and the ISO 55000, that it was the deliverer of data and information for the asset management. We're also helped along the way by, back in 2016, DEFRA made a policy decision to make all of its data open, provided we were able to. And I think this has helped our journey and helped our thinking, because it is open first. So because of that, we have developed approaches to sharing our data in a more integrated way, which I will describe a little bit more in the next few slides. This slide is just really sort of showing some of the timelines, and actually the fact that, you know, we started this out off back in 2014. I'm sitting here talking to you today in 2020. So, you know, it's been 6 years, and there were a couple of years prior to that where we spent a lot of time working out really what we had to do. So next slide, please. So this is what we're going to be covering at a high level. I'm going to cover what has been delivered, and then I'm going to be handing over to Graeme to take forward what we are delivering and moving forward. So if you can move to the next slide, please. That's the next slide again. So a very important technical specification that is part of the standards is called an employer's information requirements. And although it is aimed at construction and construction related projects, actually I think it's a really important concept that actually applies to any procured services which involve the production of data and information. So it's quite there's a standard template for it, which if you search you can find it. But initially we spent quite a bit of time just really working out what our existing standards were, and actually working with our supply chain with regards to working within the standards, but also what was actually able to be delivered. And it also helped us to transform our own data standards that existed within the organisation that hadn't been, up until that point, really passed to our supply chain. So we had good standards, but we had no mechanism for doing it. What it does do is it provides a really quite a complex, I won't say complex, more comprehensive is the word I was looking for, data and information requirements. And because we work with framework suppliers, we agree what is called a BIM execution plan, which is called a BEP, with our suppliers at framework levels. So this enables them to develop their own capability across their organisation to improve how they deliver data and information to us in a consistent way. We have always adopted the standards and worked within the standards as best we can. So I think that's been, for me, one of the main learning points is, you know, as we're moving in to the digital world, is adopting standards that exist that facilitate, even though perhaps they may not make sense to begin with, actually by doing that, it opens up the ability to digitize as you move forward in the business. Next slide, please. So another important aspect is what is called a common data environment. So from a client's perspective, we want a supplier to be managing their information and managing their supply chain's information in accordance with our requirements. But we want to retain the information on our side. And as part of that, we have developed with our partner A-Site a common data environment that meets the standards. And over time, we have worked with them to provide improved functionality. And if you move to the next slide, please. And part of that was delivering the information delivery plan. Now, as we started out on this journey, we had to really understand actually what happened. And we realized I think we had a couple of graduates working with us at the time, and we said, right, go out and have a look and see what information is being exchanged. And predominantly it was documents. And I think that's a very sort of recognizing that to move to data is part of your journey. Actually, most businesses operate with documents. So working with those documents, being able to transform them into a structure was really a good starting point. But we took the step of classifying. So all of our documents types have a classification. And I think, again, that provides a digital anchor that allows us to push and pull and improve some of the functionality that we've had on some of our tools. We've also developed the IDP, as we call it, the Information Delivery Plan, so that we can develop the required metadata that sits behind. So we can improve people's ability to do the corporate things that we need in relation to the structured data, but we can make it easier for them, so they can drag and drop onto the IDP, and the document gets stored in the common data environment, as you saw in the previous slide, which you kind of end up with a win-win situation. But one of the important components of this is the COBE data template, and that's it's part of the it's currently the BS 1192 Part 4, and this is an interoperable data exchange template, and I think it's probably one of the things that is most widely misunderstood. It's often referred to as a spreadsheet, but in actual fact it is a structured spreadsheet. It is machine readable, both in terms of being able to create data as well as push data. It's often referred to as a suitcase. It has its compartments. Information can go into and can move across. But what isn't regularly understood is that someone from a client side has to determine how that suitcase is going to be packed. So it's an extensive information data template, but there is a role for the client to define actually where that data needs to sit, and I will show you something about how we've gone about doing that. Next slide, please. So part of the journey that we've been on is also making better use of our data and with our existing technology. So our EasyMap is our GIS platform, and we spent a little bit of time improving the data feeds, improving significantly the data services that sat behind, to ensure that we were operating around the principles of the single version of the truth, although as things stand we can't necessarily achieve it to the degree that we would like because of constraints and where we are, but operating within as far as we possibly can. We've also been able to use smarter sort of connect technologies. So EasyMap, you can see that using the common data environment, we spatially locate our documents, which means that we can, using APIs, we can push the documents through to our GIS platform, which means that teams can access the documents through finding and searching on a spatial search, which again, making best use of the technology you've got to make it easier for people to do and access the information. Next slide. We've also done some work on developing dashboards, and obviously dashboards aren't anything new, but for me, what we are trying to do here is on the sort of that central platform is remove the need for individuals to be running the standard reports, the things that are happening constantly around the business, and being able to cut and dice that information. The figures in them are not sort of dummy data, but it's just an example of the sorts of capability that we have been working on. In the top left, that is where we have a word that I use as we've productized our LiDAR data. So we, as some of you may know, we have a service that captures LiDAR data of the whole country on an annual basis every 3 years. But although the information was available to us, actually people needed skills to download it and manipulate it to use it for asset management purposes. So we have taken some of that burden out, and working and with a small amount of investment have created tools that asset managers can use to evaluate and get the information they need. Next slide. We have also worked extensively to improve the external services, and if you tap into Google Environment Agency asset information, you will come to these app galleries, and this we effectively have, with the asset management space, actually done a relatively soft launch. But last year we had 200,000 APIs, individual API calls on the site. So that's been enormously useful to our teams to remove the mundane tasks, providing information to people within the construction industry, customers, etc., who can now self-serve or can connect to our services and get regular updates. Next slide. So one of the factors that I mentioned a little bit earlier is what we actually never told people. So if you think about the sort of opening slide, the problem with data and information is actually we never told people, our suppliers, what data and information we needed. So part of the problem that why we didn't get the information, we didn't enable them to do it. So we launched what is called a data requirements library, and if you tap into Google Environment Agency DRL, you can access it, and it simply transforms what was in a controlled document into a human and machine readable format with API functionality. What you will find if you click through to the attribute section, so if you click on a particular asset and work through, you can identify the COBE mapping. So we've enabled people, we've told our suppliers or anyone else that's generating asset information for us where that information needs to sit in the COBE spreadsheet. At the moment, we've started with 53 assets, but we are we're doing quite a lot of work in the background at the moment, as I described earlier, and we will be increasing that number to include a range of other assets in the next 6 to 9 months. Next slide, please. One of the sort of key developments that we've run with is we realised that we didn't have a CAD and object standard. So if we want to have the information in a structured format, and consistently we needed to develop a CAD and object standard to facilitate that. So the CAD standards facilitate the sort of the look and feel and how information is described. But we have also in the object standards included some functionality which is available called data cards. So those data cards can be used to link to the data requirements library for a particular asset type and can pull across the data requirements that we require for designers. And as they're designing the assets, they can then ensure that they are adding and managing the data that we need returned to us. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand over to Graeme, who's going to take you through what we are going to be delivering next.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. This is instantly where I get a frog in my voice, but here we go. So one of the early benefits that we can do, having put together the CAD and object standard and also the data requirements library, start thinking about how our supply chain can help classify and define our new and upgraded assets. So typically this was carried out after the end of a project or at the end of a project, which would include going out and surveying data and having people going and inputting that into systems. By getting the suppliers to classify the information, that can be exchanged with the appropriate parties on every one of our projects very early on. In fact, before a spade is put in the ground, we can make sure that the proposed design is classified and described in accordance with the requirements, so that actually the asset management teams and asset performance teams can engage to make sure that what will be delivered will actually be usable, not only in terms of managing the asset, but also usable in terms of managing the information that goes with the asset. That enabled us to streamline the process which we're going through at the moment, streamline the process of collecting the data, because as Karen described, not only are they producing the drawings, they're also producing links to the drawings in the COBE, but also all the other information that goes together. So not only is it drawings and other documents, but it's the asset data about those new assets across in the COBE file. So the COBE file got about 20 tabs. Each one of those tabs is different types of data that's all linked together into a structure, and that can be passed through, and we can read that directly into the asset systems. Hold that thought, because actually, no, it can't be read directly into, it has to be verified first. So that's enabled us to work on a journey where we can automate the process of passing through the data. And one of the major benefits is that we were expecting that the people that used to spend their time typing in and surveying can spend their time making sure that the data is right, not only in terms of what it looks like on the drawings, but also what it looks like in the systems as it comes through. Next slide, please. Along with all of this, we've got to make sure that we're instilling capability not only in our own staff, but also in the supply chain. It's no good telling our own staff how to do this if we don't tell the supply chain, and the supply chain has got a lot of knowledge in terms of what works and what doesn't work. And the other thing you've got to watch is that they're in the industry as a whole, as I'm sure there is in UK Limited, there's quite a lot of churn. So it isn't just a case of doing it once and forgetting about it, you have to keep doing it. And we've developed e-learning and slides on YouTube via open and closed channels on YouTube, so that we have got lots of nuggets of ways of working described by videos. And those videos and the e-learning go together, and the e-learning enables us to quiz people and let them understand how good they're getting at doing it. And it actually is very successful, this. Next slide. So how do our suppliers use this? Well, they need to take the CAD and object standard, and they need to take the data requirements library. This is just one small part of the whole data flow process. They would create drawings, they will create 3D models and flood models and all the other things they produce, and they will create reams of documents, as Karen said, up to 10,000 a month come through, and only some of them are COBE. So the first use of COBE is to act as a transmittal sheet for all those documents. but then it gets added to with all the data, and bringing that through as 10,000 a month. They get uploaded into the common data environment, which classifies them as a file store, so they get named correctly, they get classified as they come in, but it doesn't do anything to get the data out. So we have to then embark on a process of getting the data out, and we've decided to do it by putting it into a parallel structured data store before we put it into every system, which enables us to introduce an assurance process that's partly manual, in other words, humans making sure that they are understanding and reading things, and computers doing what computers do well. They make sure they apply rules to the data and report the process back to humans, who can then carry out a validation process to accept or otherwise the data. Next slide, please. So what we've got is a managed data flow from information creation. As Karen said, we try and capture the data as close as we can to where it's created and make the creator of the data responsible for it commercially, in not only delivering what they've built or what they're repairing, but also the data that goes with it. And that comes through, and it needs to get through to enable us to make informed decisions, either through the best of breed applications, where it feeds into, or into a repository where we can run various dashboards and reports independent of those best of breed. Next slide, please. So as I described, we need to specify the data we need, and we use the information delivery plan, we use the EIR, and we use the DRL to specify the information, the files, the documents, the drawings, and the data that we need at every gateway stage in a project. And as the project builds up, we're getting more and more enriched data, and we collect that in the common data environment, and that triggers off, or will trigger off, when we have built the rules engine, which we're in the middle of the project to do at the moment. It will trigger off when a Cody sheet arrives. It will trigger off a verification process, which runs through quite a few verification steps and feeds it back. And that enables us to pass the data, when it's assured, through into the structured data store, which acts as a data repository, which can feed or be fed the various applications and other viewing technologies that we're developing. Next slide, please. Needless to say, some of the rules, there are eight groups of them, quite a complex exercise. So first of all, we have to check the data is in accordance with the EIR, the files and their naming is in accordance with the IDP, that they're actually present. So we might have specified something and the supplier might have said they were going to deliver it, but have they delivered it? And are they named in the correct way? They are the right formats that we agreed. We then need to check this against the data requirements library, the data services platform. If we're referring to existing assets, are they real? Have they got the right asset ID? Have we used the right data from that in the designs? Have we got the project register? Are we protecting the right properties? Doing the usual spatial checks, which is no mean feat in itself, before we add in this new layer, which is basically technical authority, and I'll come on to that on the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is a quick sample. So an embankment. One of the things about an embankment is that the Environment Agency uses it as a flood defence, but others may use it as noise attenuation, or it might hold a road, or it might hold a railway. So there are various uses, but as far as the use for the Environment Agency is concerned, there are a few simple serviceability rules, and they might be, well, actually, the front face, the exposed face, if it's an embankment, it's got a slope, and if it's grassed, well, actually, it's got a slope that it can't be steeper than, because it might have a health and safety issue. If it's the rear face, if it's the non-exposed face, then it may have a problem if it's overtopped, if it's an earth embankment. So we have a minimum slope for that. There's a crest width. Actually, we've got a minimum crest width because actually we might need to reverse it. We might need to have a Land Rover go down the top of it. So we have a minimum crest width so that we can service it. And there are all sorts of serviceability rules or technical authority rules that we can use on designs, and we can check those. And actually, we might have need to do concessions in certain circumstances. So with any rules-based system, you not only need to put in the rules which you need to apply, but also a process in place that would actually capture times when you deviate from those rules. And that has to go through on that instance, and every subsequent time on this particular project it goes through, but you need to be able to collect those through so that you can annually tune up your rules. Next slide, please. So what we end up with is all of this information coming in through a DADI process into a central repository and feeding out to the best of breed applications, and those best of breed applications feeding back into the central repository. So over time we can standardize our data and our data structures, and we don't use the master data model as a name, but it's in anything else but a name. We're working towards a master data model, and we're also working towards the position where we can actually call this data repository our digital twin, which is an ecosystem of all the asset digital twins that the Environment Agency has. And we're also working towards, with the Centre for Digital Britain, towards seeing how we can make that an Environment Agency digital twin, which contributes towards a national digital twin, but that's a way off yet. So we've got one version of the truth sitting in the middle, being fed by data coming in from external third parties, and also being fed by best of breed applications being updated in the centre, which we can then move to dashboarding and reporting over the top. Now that's the next stage. We're in the middle of creating the data and getting the data through. The next stage is working strategically towards having this glue together with the DADI process doing the gluing. Next slide. So I think this, if you do another click, should give you a moving. This is all moving towards smart modeling, where we can develop objects that can be developed, that can be run along a line, so that when it comes to upgrading an embankment, we can use technology tools to rapidly produce designs, not final designs, but design options that can rapidly apply those rules to those objects. But not only that, apply cost and carbon impacts of those. So we can move to a position where we're rapidly generating model options for these solutions and rapidly improving both the cost of developing the options, but also the speed in which we can get those. And over 80% of our assets are walls and embankments. So we're focusing on walls and embankments to get that right first, and then we're moving on to other things like simple trash screens, complex trash screens, and other more complex structures. Next slide. I think we should be able to get to the next slide. There we go. That's it. So this is the final slide, which is the key benefits. So we need to specify the data we need. We need to ensure it and make sure its provenance, because we want to hold it in an immutable fashion. All the documents that we hold immutably, so we can go back in history and confirm when we got information, who purchased it, who procured it, who delivered it, and how it was used. We are working on a smart and lean approach to get ourselves smarter and quicker. And we're hoping to make sure that all of our stakeholders, internally and externally, are more informed and can make decisions faster and more efficiently. And it also enables the Environment Agency to spend public money more effectively and achieve the high levels of protection that we are now expecting from the Environment Agency for our flood assets. Next slide, I think that is over to questions.
All right, well, thank you, Graeme. Thank you, Karen. That was really useful and really informative. I think what was really good to see is, bearing in mind that we're all coming from a data background, there are many organisations I know of who are embarking on that journey would have taken a very software-driven approach, and yet you've very clearly taken a data-driven approach. Any thoughts on how you got your senior stakeholders to start on that journey and to keep them on that journey?
Shall I take that one?
Yes.
I think this is where the BIM mandate helped because we had to look at how we could implement the BIM, the mandate, which was a data-driven one. So at the outset, did we envisage back in 2013, 2014, did we envisage where we'd be today? Absolutely not. But as we worked through delivering against the BIM mandate, so it became clearer the role of getting our data, the role that data played, and actually what we needed to do to structure and inform and actually fill the gaps. Because and I'll give you, a really good example. We have a cost tool. We describe assets differently in that cost tool than we do in our asset management system. For the purposes of those IT systems, doesn't really make any difference. However, for the purposes of the organisation, we end up having to effectively employ people to make sense of that data and information. And I think the awareness was raised that we needed to take a handle on it, but it came from the mandate pushing us to think differently. And because we then could provide the answers to and give senior managers options for moving forward and overcoming some of those legacy problems that we had experienced, it just then opened their eyes as to what was possible. I don't know whether there's anything else you'd like to add, Graeme.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that one of the issues in moving towards a data-driven approach is that quite often people think when they've got a problem that they see IT to solve, or let's go and buy a piece of software, or let's go and buy a system. And that's been one of the senior level challenges. I won't say it's wrong or right, but one of the challenges is that people think that if you just go and buy a system, you'll solve your problems. and actually, we found through bitter experience that actually you don't. And unless you can capture the data at source and make sure you're verifying, validating and assuring the data, all the system does is report rubbish data. And referring back to your book, Julian, I'm sure you're aware of this. One of the big problems is, whilst you've got a very good system, people don't like filling out data, and they don't like, so it was very evident at a reasonably high level in the organisation that just having really good software systems wasn't the whole answer, and we need to do more. And I think that gave the support to needing to do something extra. And again, if you need people to handle data, then they've got to be experienced in it. You can't expect people to just be able to do it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's clearly a change in mindset. So moving on a little bit, then Ant Friedel's asked a question about the common data store. Is it a single place or multiple storage areas? Is it a cloud storage, or is it on premises? And sort of what and where are the documents, records and drawings that can be accessed via the API?
It's a cloud-based system. It's A-Site. Karen said that. We've been probably 10 years with A-Site. It's gone through various re-procurements to see whether or not it was still the best tool on the market, and we ended up keeping it. So we've got thousands of documents there. It's a cloud-based system, so all the documents are held in the cloud. We've developed with them the common data environment approach, which is a workflow-based approach, and actually they now take advantage of the development we've done with them to sell it to other government departments and other suppliers. So they're all stored in the cloud. We could pull them down if we wanted to. In fact, we may well archive them, but as you can see with the number 10,000 a month, we need something pretty special. Naming them correctly is the only way to find them, and naming them at the point of upload is the only way to make sure they're classified. So we need a pretty specialist tool, but actually it's one of a breed now that's available in the UK. I would suggest that the UK are probably in advance of those sorts of tools, cloud-based workflow management tools for delivery of documents. They need to be improved in terms of extracting the data from documents. So it is a cloud-based tool that environment agency take advantage of.
Yeah, that's good, thank you. So a question from Farfan, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. So question about the amount of legacy data that you've obviously been having to deal with and how to get that labelled. So how did you involve the data owners to identify what the data was, where it went, and whether you had any issues with scanning?
Karen, did you want to start that one off?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. So what we have predominantly spoken about is the sort of new data, new information, but we have also implemented what we call the AIM store, which is using the same structure as the common data environment, but for existing data. It's using the same sort of metadata structures. Now, it is going to take a number of years for us to transform all of our existing documentation into that structure. And we have just started. Our approach at the moment is a lot of our information is electronic. We are taking the sort of scanning that. The quantity of scanning is could be quite significant. So at this present moment in time, we're taking a on a needs to know, because obviously some of that information may have become out of date and actually adds little value. But I think that is a big challenge, and it's not so much the scanning; it's actually being able to find it is the big challenge. But I think that's a problem that most organisations have, and you can throw lots of money at it, or as we're doing, actually we recognise that at the right point we will find that information and add it in.
Yeah, so it's a sort of softly catch your monkey type approach rather than rushing ahead at great speed and great cost, presumably. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Question now from Tim King, who you'll be hearing speak later in the week with me about our book that we released. He's asking about the validation and verification within the Environment Agency, and so how they relate to each other, and how do you distinguish between the two of them, because some people do get confused there. Is the meaning of the terms defined by one of the standards that you use?
It's defined by one of in the Environment Agency, and it's not clear in the standards. The Environment Agency has defined validation as, I'm not going to quote it specifically, but effectively it's making sure that the data is fit for purpose. In other words, mostly it's done by humans, and verification is the one that we can automate. So, 2 + 2 does equal 4, and 4 is in the range that it should be, and the rules will be, so the verification is done through automation. And you're absolutely right, there is a complete confusion in the industry about which is which, and it's also across industry. So you'll hear in the IT industry, which talks about validation when in our world it means verification, etc. And it does need to be confirmed and clarified. And I would hope you may have covered that in your book. But actually, that's for the Environment Agency. That's the way we verify stuff through an automated trigger approach, and we feed that back. And subject matter experts need to then look at the results of the verification and the contents of drawings and documents to make sure they meet the requirements, which is validation for us. So I hope that's answered it.
Yeah, I think it has, and actually Tim has put some follow-on comments there, so it is clear in ISO 8000, and the EA definition matches those, so well done, he said. So congratulations from Tim there. Question from Emmanuel Ude, which actually relates to one I would have asked if he hadn't asked already, was you talked about the data being defaulted to open, so how do you manage security, and with the different classification, how do you actually manage it in a pragmatic way across the whole data set?
So I'll probably answer that in sort of 2 ways. First off, our existing data that we publish, we run through an open data risk assessment. So each data set that we make public, we evaluate the risks associated with it, and that's that then sort of drives the publication or not. What we're also working on at the moment is how we can provide the security wrapper, which 11 BS 1192 Part 5, and actually the new which I think is out now for comment, the ISO 19650 Part 5 security. So actually how we can integrate the security at the production aspect. So the way that we foresee managing this is through, because we have structures around our volume and location codes that are prescribed, and so we have a methodology. So we plan to be using the volume and location codes to putting that security wrapper on data and information that is created, and data and information that is on existing assets in the future.
Yeah, good, thank you. And another question from Emmanuel Ude, which is, how do you manage the metadata tagging within the system? So, for example, given his CRS tags for GIS or GI data as a means of ensuring that the data is of the right quality for end users.
Do you want to take that one, Graeme?
Yeah, sure. Certainly with the focus at the moment has been on document metadata, which we use the ISO and the BS to define it, but we've also got extended data tags, metadata tags. In fact, we've got 13 metadata tags on each document, which sounds a lot, but we've tried to pull it down, and that's it. That covers the documents. And at the moment, in terms of tagging those documents, for historic documents, we tag those to known geographies. In other words, geographies we have defined, that are defined through GIS mapping, and we have various teams to make sure that those geographies are right. We're now moving into a phase where the suppliers are defining the geography, and actually part of the verification process is to make sure that basically line strings that are used to describe the wireframe of these assets, which is probably enough for us to check where they are and the extent of them and the height of them and all these slopes and things, to make sure that the wireframes for those, which is passed across in JSON, it meets the data requirements standards. We're not using shapefiles for that in the new system. We traditionally use shapefiles, which require metadata tagging in the normal way. That hasn't directly answered your question because I've avoided it, but it's as far as I can go at the moment.
Oh, fair enough, but it is very much about getting the tagging and the structure of the tagging right, which is obviously key, and getting the definitions there. Yeah, no, that's good. And
at the point of entry, you know, we have systems where people thought to go back and tag this data. It don't work. They just don't do it. So if it's not tagged, it doesn't come in.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, so we've got another question. Just about to say we've got to the end of the questions. There's one more just appeared for handing up to Nicholas if she's got any. So another one from Farfan. Do you also provide your contractors with guidelines and standards on data to be provided to use so they can be easily loaded or even directly uploaded into the data stores?
Yes, through the EIR. It's through the employer's information requirements, which covers things in, even though it's human readable, it covers things, and also the data requirements library can be read through JSON or CSV directly, so they can integrate it with, and the data requirements library, you can go online and have a look at it, not only defines the name of each attribute, but also defines the data quality requirements for each attribute, and also where it goes in geocoded format. So we've defined it right. We've also classified each asset to Uniclass, which is the standard UK standard for classifying environmental assets and other assets, built assets. So we've gone as far as we can, but we have to let so much of it down to the suppliers, because after all, they've got to author this data. Karen, did you have any comment on that?
No, I think that, yeah, that's fine. And I guess what We will expand, and I think it's probably fair to say that our supply chain are developing their capability to do some of this as well. So we mandated the production of data just a few weeks ago, in line with our using our CAD and object standards and the data requirements library. We know that we had a hackathon, ran a hackathon last year, so we know that it's possible, and there are various different ways of doing that. But we absolutely know that our supply chain are yet to comprehensively across their teams have that capability. So we're working with them in the next few months to support and share that development, to then deliver what I would call the simple data, with a view then to moving to more comprehensive and complex data over time.
One of the problems we've got, sorry, I'll just jump in on that one, is that the current commercial contracts that engage with the construction industry still predominantly require documents to be exchanged, and we therefore build the data in as document exchanges. We don't allow direct upload of data from those contracts, and obviously we have to procure the data to be able to rely on it through the contract. Therefore we have to specify and make sure it's right at the point of delivery. So there's a very strong commercial reason why we don't allow, under the FCRM contracts, we don't allow uploaded pure data because it needs to be authored and provenance, etc.
Yeah, no, that's good, thank you. I think we're just running out of time at the moment. So Nick, I don't know if you've got any questions from your end?
No, I found it really, really fascinating. I suppose so, just a very quick one of the perks of being on the hosting team. I just think you sound like you've done some amazing things and have got great plans. I just wondered if I'm sure there's been many on the way, but what would you say was your biggest challenge you've had to face in getting this delivered?
Oh dear.
People.
Yeah.
The technology is easy.
I think there's a few people who agree with that.
So, no, I just think, I just think it sounds like you've done some brilliant stuff, and thank you so much for sharing it. It's been absolutely fascinating.